Prevails.
Thank you.
Next, we have before us a guest. Mr. Grogan is here to talk to us about the transfer of the cable franchise and change of control of the grantee. Many of you may recall that Comcast and Time Warner earlier in 2014 announced that they were going to merger. That has ripple effects as to our local cable provider. We're very pleased to have Mr. Grogan here to guide us through this very technical process. So thank you so much for being here tonight, Brian.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. I'm very thankful that he's here to get this presentation up, because that's where the presentation would stop if he weren't right here. So is it just the arrow keys then? Yeah. Okay. For the record, again, my name is Brian Grogan. I'm an attorney with the Minneapolis law firm of Moss & Barnett, here tonight working with the city on this transaction. Just to be clear with everyone, I'm in this capacity tonight representing the city of Hastings, so with and through your city attorney. I don't believe a representative of Comcast or the other companies are here tonight, so I'll do my best to answer questions. You may have certain questions for the company, and if that's the case, I can certainly take those back and try to get written responses for you. This is a complicated transaction. I went through it with your utilities group earlier this evening. I'm going to try to keep this to about 15 to 20 minutes, but absolutely will be available for questions after. So this all started last February when Comcast chose to acquire Time Warner Cable. Time Warner has been looking to get out of the business, so the combined company would take approximately 20+ million customers that Comcast currently owns, combine them with about 11.5 million customers of Time Warner, and create a company that would have 34 million customers nationwide. I'm going to show you a map in a moment that kind of illustrates what this means. That particular number, 34 million, though, would actually create a communications company that holds in excess of 30% of all customers in the country, a threshold that the FCC usually doesn't tolerate. So Comcast voluntarily agreed to divest itself of about 4 million of those customers in an effort to fall below that threshold and really escape some of the antitrust concerns that they're fearful of at the federal level. So looking at a map of this to kind of illustrate what this big transaction means, you can see the dot representing the Twin Cities market. That's where Comcast currently holds cable systems in the state today. I'm a little colorblind, but I would call that orangish red is the Time Warner systems. The blue are the Comcast systems. And you can see why these two companies want to combine. They would end up holding control of most of the major top 20 television markets in the United States if this transaction ultimately gets approved. And I should mention that it is still awaiting federal approval. The FCC will act on this sometime in the first quarter of 2015, probably towards the end of March. So that federal approval is still outstanding. It is, though, not uncommon that cities have to act in advance of that because we're held to a different statute. As I've commented before, the feds are usually good about imposing deadlines on cities for actions. They're not as good at following those deadlines themselves, so they give themselves a little more time to act on these transactions. This chart illustrates the top 10 cable operators in the country, and if we focus on Minnesota, you can see the blue that represents Comcast. The green represents Charter Communications. The yellow is another company called Mediacom. But I want you to take a moment and look at the green, because Charter is going to come up in the discussion tonight. They will be, in essence, providing certain operational services here in the Hastings market. So back to the original dialogue, we have 34 million customers with this combined company. They need to divest themselves of 4 million. They go out on the market. Charter agrees to buy 1.4 million, but they don't have the financial resources to buy all 4 million at one time. Comcast and Charter agree to that transaction. They also swap customers in certain markets to create some regional clusters that make sense for their business plan. That leaves 2.5 million customers remaining. So for a moment, let's talk about Charter, because again, they're going to come back in this presentation. Charter's presence in Minnesota extends from Duluth all the way down to Winona. You can see the list of cities there. They hold St. Cloud, Rochester, a number of large markets outside the Twin Cities metro area, which is held by Comcast. They serve 6 million customers nationwide in about 29 different states. They're a Fortune 500 company. If this transaction closes the way I describe it this evening, Charter is going to end up operating more than 10 million customers. In other words, they will provide operational support for nearly 10 million customers, a substantial step up from the 6 million that they're serving today. But back to that 2.5 million customers. So that's the amount that Comcast still has to divest. They couldn't find anybody willing to acquire those at under the conditions that they were seeking. So they decided to basically create a new company called Midwest Cable. It started out being referred to as SpinCo, which is a placeholder for a spin-off company. Then they named it Midwest Cable. If this transaction closes, it will be renamed Greatland Connections. So that is the name of the company, the doing business name that they will have here in Hastings and throughout the metro area. Again, they'll have 2.5 million customers. The Twin Cities market will constitute 550,000 of those customers. So this marketplace will be a fifth of all the subscribers they own. They'll have properties in Minnesota, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, all the way down to Alabama, which, as I commented to the utilities group, that's exactly why they needed to change the name from Midwest. Alabama doesn't consider themselves part of the Midwest. Greatland Connections, I think, is a better label for the company overall. There'll be a publicly traded company, assuming this gets approved. And the financial review, when you have a brand new company, is extraordinarily difficult. You know, as I commented earlier this evening to, again, the utilities group, I've been asked now in many different council meetings that I've made this presentation at, you know, did you look at their financial history? Did you look at their past performance? Did you look at where they held franchises around the country? Did you call the mayor and city administrators in other cities? And the answer is I didn't do any of those things because they don't exist today. They are on paper a company that will, if this all closes, be created solely for the purpose of acquiring these 2.5 million customers. So looking at financial history isn't going to tell us anything. They don't exist, nor can I look at their technical or legal background to see how they've operated. Looking at how they fit into the picture of the country, Midwest is represented by those orange dots there, and you can see the Twin Cities market. The kind of darker bluish dots represent where Charter currently operates cable systems today. And you can see in part why these markets were selected. It's because Charter has operations surrounding where Midwest will acquire, and Midwest knows it's going to have to rely on Charter for several of these, or for much of the operational support. So drilling down now more specifically on Midwest Cable. They will be controlled by a board of directors. They will be owned 33%, or 1/3, by Charter Communications, so by the corporate entity itself. They'll be owned 2/3 by Comcast shareholders. And there's a distinction between the ownership of a shareholder and the ownership of a company. Comcast itself will not own any aspect of Midwest Cable. They can't, because that's the whole purpose of this, is to divest themselves of that ownership interest in these subscribers. They'll have 9 board members. Interestingly, the chairman of that board will be the same individual, a gentleman named Tom Rutledge, who serves as chief executive officer of Charter. I know you're going to have trouble keeping all these names together. It's safe to say there's a very close nexus between Midwest and Charter. The two companies share many different synergies, those you can see that are listed here in this slide. They have hired a separate chief operating officer or chief executive officer for Midwest, a gentleman by the name of Michael Wilner. He has over 40 years experience in the cable industry, and he's brought his entire executive team that worked with a company called Insight Communications to run this company. But as I mentioned a moment ago, they have no operating history, and really they're going to be relying substantially on Charter for operations. This is just a schematic to show what the structure would look like if you were to chart it out. It really just, in graph form, describes or shows what I described a moment ago. Very briefly, the timeline for action. Typically, we should have been taking action on this within 120 days of the day we were asked to review this transaction. And the City of Hastings received the application in June of this year. So did every other city in the Twin Cities market. About over 80 cities received this same application. The reason we didn't take action within 120 days is because the companies weren't ready to explain the transaction yet. They were still submitting filings to the Securities and Exchange Commission as late December of 2014. So they have voluntarily agreed to extend the deadline for your consideration of this transaction. The most recent deadline now is January 30th of this month. So to the extent the council isn't ready to take action tonight, I'd go back and get yet a further extension to allow you more time to consider this. Your obligation in this, under both your franchise and state law, is you're required to review the legal, technical, financial qualifications of this new company and to decide whether it is sufficient to carry on the operations of your cable system here in Hastings. Local operations. We're starting now to drill down on exactly what the impact of this transaction will be to your constituents. First of all, the trucks that drive through your city, the men and women that drive those trucks, the technical employees, will all be Midwest Cable employees or Greatland employees. I'm going to continue to refer to them as Midwest because that's their legal name as we sit here today. So all that personnel will ultimately be employees. So will the government affairs personnel, the people that interact with your city staff, with your mayor, with you elected officials. Those will also be offered the opportunity to be retained by Midwest Cable. But virtually all other operational services are going to be handled by charter personnel. That's what makes this transaction so unique. It's not a straight normal transfer where a new company comes in and that's who we're dealing with. Here you basically have a new company coming in that's going to have a substantial subcontract relationship with charter because they need that expertise that charter provides in order to operate this system. So we're going to go through very briefly what it is that charter is going to do for you that Midwest can't do for you. First, it's important to note that Midwest is going to pay 4.25% or $4.25 out of every 100 they bring in to charter to pay for these services. Now that's just off the top. That's every dollar they bring in for voice, video, and data. So not just cable. Every dollar they bring in, they'll be paying 4.25% over. On top of that, they'll pay actual costs. Every time charter answers a phone, Midwest Cable will be getting a bill for that service that they're offering. Now, Midwest Cable won't have to hire all those employees and pay for the call centers and do all those things, but you can tell right now there's going to be added costs that this company will incur that a typical pre-existing cable operator would not have to incur. You bet.
Councilmember Lodge, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, and you may have been just on the cusp of then explaining that, and I know that early on you said something on the order of like, well, we need to make sure we have this separate from that. But given that this is less efficient than having just a regular merger or acquisition of a kind, why are they doing this, in your legal opinion? What is the advantage either to the company or their customers? Because the less efficient the operation is, the more I think it drives customers nuts. They don't know who's billing them. They don't know what these charges are. There's names listed that they don't understand, and they're already moving away from a company they've come to know and trust. So can you explain that, please?
Well, it's a great question. I think that it's not so much as why did they intentionally structure it this way. It's that they couldn't structure it as a straight transfer to charter. Charter didn't have the financial ability, or at least as it's been indicated in the press, to acquire it today. The transaction calls for charter. They cannot purchase the interest in Midwest Cable for at least 3 years. So this separation will exist for 3 years. Thereafter, though, the assumption, at least from reading the trades and from reading the analyst's opinion, is charter is extraordinarily well positioned to then acquire this, because at that point they hope to have the resources to acquire the additional $2.5 million.
Thanks. That answers my question well. Appreciate it.
That's an important fact, I think.
Absolutely. I think everyone would probably appreciate the cleaner path that you're describing. Simply wasn't possible. Companies couldn't put that together. This list is unique, and let's try to break it down to what it means for your constituents. If you currently take Xfinity Cable today, that's the branding package that we have when we buy Comcast services. That will change to something called Spectrum. That's the new brand that Charter uses today. If you're in Rochester or if you're in Lakeville, that's what Charter sells you, is the Spectrum brand of services. That's what will be sold here in Hastings. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Bloomington will all have Spectrum. All the programming agreements that support Spectrum, of course, are controlled by Charter. Since Midwest has no programming agreements, they're going to rely on Charter for all those negotiations. Now, important to keep in mind, no one has better programming agreements, at least anecdotally that we're told, in the industry, better than Comcast. They're the largest cable operator. they're able to negotiate stronger deals. By stronger, I mean more affordable deals that put less pressure on subscriber rates. The charter transaction will result in higher programming costs. Almost everybody in the industry, though, in fairness, has higher programming costs than Comcast, so that wouldn't be surprising, but it's an aspect to keep in mind. As we go through this list, network operations, all the folks that make the network run, the behind-the-scenes broadband services, telephone services, all that IT and engineering will be handled by Charter, not by Midwest. Those employees aren't coming over as part of this. Everything that runs the phone system, the voice operations, all customer service will be handled by Charter. So when a Hastings resident calls for cable customer service, it won't go to a Midwest representative, it will go to a Charter representative that will be basically representing Midwest in that transaction. Midwest has at least commented that they may be acquiring a call center because of the volume of calls that they'll be handling, but they haven't committed to that yet. But going down the list further, all billing, collections, marketing, sales, administrative back office, everything is going to be handled by Charter as part of this, what they call a Charter Services Agreement. Extraordinarily complicated. I've been doing this for 25 years, almost exclusively representing cities and counties in this. I haven't seen quite this relationship. You're always going to subcontract out a certain amount. This is a fairly substantial amount, though, to be dealing with. So again, drilling even further now, what is the absolute impact on the customers here? If you have a Comcast telephone number, which I have at my house, I have a Comcast triple play, so I have their phone number, you keep that. We have in Minnesota, through the Public Utilities Commission, something called number portability. Everyone gets to keep their phone number, no change there. Subscribers can keep their cable equipment. So if you have the Xfinity boxes, if you have the remote controls, if you have that equipment in your home, that will not need to be changed out. It is compatible with Charter's system. Of course, there's always the ability for them to change that down the road, but for the foreseeable future, no touches on that. Email is not as good a news. Those of you who have a Comcast.net email, if you take your service through Comcast, that will go away. They will no longer be your provider. They'll have a transition period, and then they'll notify you that you'll need to switch to a new domain name. Most likely it will be charter.com. Midwest doesn't currently have any domain names, so we assume that to be the case. They haven't committed to exactly what the email domain will be, but it could very well be charter.com. That will be an impact on those subscribers that have relied on Comcast.net. It'll also be an impact for those that have run home businesses, small businesses using that Comcast.net. I was asked at an earlier City Council meeting this month whether any of the companies would be providing support for those who have to switch out. Business cards, letterhead, notification to business consultants, etc. The answer is that none of that has been offered at this point. They do offer a transition to say that they will maintain the Comcast.net email for a period of time and forward to the new domain, but there is no offer of any financial assistance. Another question may be, well, why, Mr. Grogan, did you not condition our approval, if we're going to approve this, on that obligation? And the answer is, we only in Hastings have a cable franchise with this company. We don't regulate their telephone service or their broadband service at the local level, just their cable television or video product. So there's only so much we can do legally, and it really relates to their cable product, not to these other ancillary services. Billing shouldn't be a very problematic issue. It will transition, of course, to Greatland. I'm a Comcast customer in St. Paul. I have it automatically debited from my bank account, so I don't have to write that check every month. I will have to call my bank and say, don't pay Comcast, pay this new entity, and they'll have to deal with that issue. Every one of those issues that requires a customer touch, if you will, if there's a disruption to a customer, is the possibility of generating more phone calls. If you have 550,000 people that have different issues on this, you can see the concern about customer service, and will constituents be able to get those answers when they need them. And that's what I'm going to describe here as we move towards the resolution. The financial review is a huge issue here. There is at least 7 to 8 pages in the transfer report that's part of your packet that describes this in fairly significant detail. It is not a fair comparison to look at this company and say, how does it relate to Comcast? Comcast is one of the most financially stable communications companies in the United States. They have very low leverage, very low debt, given the total assets that they control. The leverage that Midwest will have will be comparable to the operators that you see listed here: Charter, Cablevision, Suddenlink, Mediacom. But there's no question there will be greater debt. They will be taking on nearly $8 billion in debt to finance this system. So it will put pressure on subscriber rates. It will put pressure on the amount of capital that they have available to improve the system. There's not very many other ways to look at that, and I think the financial report summarizes those. Now, in fairness, the company does provide what they believe to be some pro forma projections that they think will increase cash flow and they think will actually operate more efficiently than in some ways it does today. So there's no way to measure that, of course. We don't have a historical record to look back on that we can measure this particular model against. So I'll ask you to rely upon the financial review that's in the report as you make that assessment. The resolution, and we're nearing the end of this presentation, that I have before you calls for an approval of this transaction based on conditions. First condition would be that the operating entity would be that the performance would be guaranteed by Great Land Connections. So Great Land is going to have different operating entities depending upon where you are in the Twin Cities and whether you're in Detroit, whether you're in Indiana. They'll have, like any large company, they'll have a multiple number of operating entities. We've asked that the contractual obligations contained in the Hastings franchise will be guaranteed by the parent company, in this case Great Land Connections, which we have actually attached as part of this resolution. If you choose to approve the resolution, you'll be requiring as a condition of their acceptance that they approve also that guarantee. All of this, by the way, I have already run by the legal counsel for Comcast, for Great Land, and for Charter, so I can represent that this, if approved by the city, would be acceptable to the companies. Customer service is the key issue here. And because this is in a state of transition, and frankly the companies, this is their first time through this kind of a transaction as well, where you have this kind of a substantial service agreement, the best condition that we thought would make the most sense for the city would be to require face-to-face conversations with Midwest employees every quarter for the first 24 months of this franchise term, if the city desires it, where they're going to come out and explain to you how this transition is going forward, what steps they've put in place. Keep in mind that you have fairly aggressive customer service obligations under your current franchise. That expires in October of 2016. But as that sits today, you can enforce those obligations under Midwest. They step into the shoes of Comcast under this transaction. So we've asked for that condition. We've also asked that they put in place what we're referring to as an escalated complaint program, meaning that if you have constituents here in Hastings that are unable through the 1-800 number to get satisfaction on their customer issues, they can contact your staff, they can contact Tom, they can contact anyone here at the city. The city can put them in touch with an escalated group of customer care individuals that the company has agreed to provide that can troubleshoot that complaint and then report back to your city staff that the complaint has been adequately addressed. We think that's important because there are going to be people that are going to slip through the cracks on this. It's just too much transition, and this was a key issue that we wanted to see put in place. The company's agreed to provide that. Lastly, and probably least important, but still relevant for the city's budget, is they have agreed to reimburse all of your costs incurred on this. And I would analogize this to if you were going to approve a liquor license transfer and you had to do due diligence on the new applicant, you would expect the applicant or the transferor to reimburse the city for that kind of cost. You'll be made whole in terms of all your costs on this. And in conclusion, what I would say is, if the FCC approves this transaction, obviously this resolution will be effective as it relates to Midwest Cable, and it will allow the city to continue to enforce the franchise. If the transaction is denied by the FCC, you'll still get the benefit of the reimbursement of costs through this transaction, but Comcast will remain your operator. It will basically be business as usual. How that impacts your franchise renewal is either we'll be negotiating with Comcast, because the transaction would be denied at the federal level, or we'll be negotiating with Midwest Cable. That will probably occur sometime later this year as we gear up towards the 2016 expiration date. So this resolution should not have any adverse impact on your negotiating position during renewal. So with that, Mr. Mayor, I will pause and stand for any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Grogan. That's a great presentation, and it's very complex, and thanks for helping us break it down a little bit.
Absolutely.
If I may ask, you helped us to negotiate our first, or our last agreement with Comcast. I think many would agree that was an outstanding agreement. What we're able, and thank you very much for your service to the city of Hastings in that agreement. I am concerned when we get to October of 2016, if we're negotiating, let's say, with Midwest and not charter, because let's face it, down the road it's going to be charter, how that will play into what we might be able to extract in those negotiations compared to what we've already received in our current franchise agreement. Any thoughts on that?
You know, it's going to be difficult to predict. What we hear from the Midwest staff that has come in town, and we've met some of the executive staff, we being those of us who are reviewing this transaction, they have stated unequivocally that they expect to be the ones in the chair negotiating this next renewal, and that, you know, there's no guarantee that they do sell this system in 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. They may continue to operate this system. They will be a separately publicly traded company. They'll answer to their own shareholders. You know, and to that end, they have a vested interest in seeing the system run and be successful. In fact, I think by the numbers that we've seen, they may very well be a Fortune 500 company the day they're created, based on the, you know, their total assets that they'll have. Having said that, the fact that the current Chief Executive Officer of Charter will be on the board of directors and will in fact be the chairman of the board of Midwest, I think what we're going to find is there's going to be a great deal of cooperation between those two companies, and I suspect who you're going to be negotiating with, and as that renewal occurs, those two companies will be communicating very closely that whatever Great Land agrees to is something that Charter also approves of.
Gotcha. Sounds reasonable. Council, is there questions on this item? Councilmember Alonji?
Thanks, Your Honor. Would you mind going back one slide? Sure. Thank you. So I'm looking at the escalated complaint process maintained. And I understand that the Utilities Committee just met on this too, so forgive me if I'm repeating a question or going over territory that you've already gone over. My question is actually for Melanie. Based on what I'm understanding here, if there is a significant, I understand it wouldn't just be your run-of-the-mill, I don't like what I just heard sort of thing, but a significant complaint, have we estimated, do we have any sense of what kind of impact that would have on staff time? How would we manage that? I mean, we're going to be put in the middle of, you know, I just called the cable company, I waited 40 minutes, this is not necessarily against Charter.net, this is like any cable company. You know, I waited 40 minutes for this, that, and the other thing, I didn't get this right. It could be a customer or user error, it could be the company, whatever the case may be. We are now going to be in the middle of that for the hottest cases. And if the service, if you escalate it and you use whatever, let's say Julie, because Julie's sitting there, you know, so Julie is now, you know, the escalation officer for the city, and Julie takes that and relays that on to the company, to their escalation team, and the escalation team comes back and let's say they do a great job, but it's still not clear or something's just, you know, just not quite right. The city is now taking ownership of a cable box issue, and we are now in the business of doing that. I understand why it's necessary. Good negotiate. I mean, I get it. We're trying to get good customer service here. I'm just checking city staff's readiness, enthusiasm, cost, time in this endeavor, so that we can enter this with really clear eyes, because it's gonna take some of your time, it sounds like.
Your Honor and Counsel, we are always ready to help the public. That being said, I don't know how to estimate what kind of calls might come in. I can speak to the last 2 years or so when I have gotten the calls. There have maybe been a dozen of them. And on the bill, it says your franchisee is City of Hastings, attention City Administrator. And they've been fairly easy to resolve thus far. Comcast has been good to deal with and resolving it with the customer base. Going forward, I can't speak to it.
Sure.
But you know that we would be more than willing, and obviously work to find resolution as quickly as possible. Maybe Brian has an experience that he could share.
If I could try to add to that, I think that's the right answer, is it's hard to predict. There is, misery loves company, I guess would be the, you have 85-plus cities that are going to be in the exact same position as you are. Some with dedicated executive staff that serve for commissions that will be doing nothing but handling this, and others that are in exactly your position where they have 100 other hats they have to wear for the city. This is just one piece of what they do. The expectation is that if there are hiccups or road bumps as they go through this process, that the Twin Cities market as a whole is trying to work together. There's been a lot of cooperation in this review with the other cities, whether I represent them or other attorneys represent them. We've been on the phone with the league. We've been on the phone with a group called MACTA, which is many cities belong to, that kind of regulate cable operators. So while it's hard to predict, I do expect that if there are significant problems, you'll have the collective force of the whole Twin Cities market talking directly to Midwest saying, we need this fixed. We can't have our staff spending 20% of their time doing this. And then I think what happens is you use your enforcement tools in your franchise. They'd be in violation of the customer service provisions. You draw from their letter of credit. You take out of their performance bond. You do what you have to. Not that we want to make money off of this, but what we want to do is get them to provide the customer service you're hoping.
It's an incentive, understood. Thank you, that
Thank you
does
for
help.
some of those remedies that you suggested. And I would also say that Tom Wright's here with Channel 14 as the executive director. He has a lot of knowledge in helping us out, and I know working with you, Brian, and I'm sure Tom Wright would also be a part of this process as well, and you'd probably get some of those calls too, Tom. So I'm sure we would all work together trying to assure that, and I appreciate all of the work that you've done to get us this far too, Tom. The first email I got about this came from Tom with a good explanation about where we're going. So I think we'd probably have future meetings ahead of us, I think.
And really
Councilmember Lodge?
super quick corollary, and thank you. And by the way, I'm noting that some staff have some really well-behaved children here, so we're trying to be super quick about this, and we get it. Thank you very much. I've been there, get it. I think even at 15 and 19, my kids not be as well-behaved as the two that are back there, so well done. But so really quickly then, Your Honor, I say that the next line there on that particular slide, notice the reimbursement of all transfer cost. Is there any portion of an anticipated amount of staff time for the first year or so for any of that relaying? Is that any part of that reimbursement, or is the transfer cost just the administrative?
At this point, it's limited to the out-of-pocket costs that the city incurred, so that it would have a zero impact on your budget. Okay. So I did not pursue anything beyond that.
Understood. Just wanted to clarify.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Hey, Councilmember Balsanic.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Okay, so the new company is going to be, what did you say, $7 billion plus in debt
Correct.
on this whole thing. Concerns about any kind of, if there's any kind of a disaster, whether it's Homeland Security type situation, natural disaster, where there's going to have to be a huge influx to get things repaired, back up and running again. How are they going to handle this with the indebtedness that they already will take on?
Honestly, that's not a question I asked of them, and I'll give you credit because I've been asked by a lot of different council members a lot of questions, and usually I had already asked those in written documents to the company, so I would be able to at least tell you what their written answer was. I don't know that I have an answer for, and let's take it out of the context of it. Let's assume a tornado goes through and tears up the entire system, and now they have, through lack of insurance coverage or otherwise, they have to rebuild this system. What resources will they have? I can say that so far they do not indicate they're having trouble financing this. They expect to have this fully financed by some rather substantial banks, although that's confidential at this point. Obviously, if they don't finance it, the transaction fails, it doesn't move forward. The fact that their debt leverage will not be substantially different than what Charter, Suddenlink, Mediacom, and other companies means that we would be in no worse position than those. But clearly, Councilmember, we will not be in as good a position had Comcast remained our operator, simply because they wouldn't have that same debt obligation.
Yeah, that is a concern that I have. One more item. In terms of, what do we need for a vote on this? Just a majority vote? Or?
Yeah, we'll have a resolution before us, so once that's moved, and then they'll take a majority vote.
Okay. I have a question for our legal counsel. My wife and I own stock in Comcast, Dan. Should I abstain from voting on this, or is it okay to vote?
Defer here, but I don't see that as a publicly traded entity. That ownership interest not controlling, I don't see that as a conflict, but maybe if you'd chime in.
I don't believe so unless you hold, some substantial interest in it. Frankly, probably everyone in the room that owns a mutual fund owns some portion of Comcast stock. To be honest, they're fairly common to see in almost every mutual fund. On its face, I don't believe there's any conflict of interest. Obviously, the best gauge of that, though, if you feel as though you're in a position where your vote would be compromised because of that, simply recuse yourself from the vote, and there's sufficient numbers here where the council would still have a quorum to take action.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
Councilmember Nelson?
Your Honor. Brian, quickly, just to play devil's advocate here, what would happen if we voted no to this resolution?
Yeah, and I've been asked that in other cities as well. The scenario is not overly favorable if you vote no, and I think I'm guessing a little bit here about what would happen, but in all likelihood, if the feds approve this transaction, whether it's the city of Hastings or the city of Minneapolis that denies this, it's still going to close. This is a $50 billion with a B transaction that covers almost every city in the nation is touched in one way or shape or form by it. So it likely still closes. They would either close over the top of the city, meaning they'd close regardless of your denial, and then would wait to see whether you would in fact choose to impose liquidated damages against them for violating the franchise by transferring without your written approval. Or they would close around you, meaning they would retain ownership of Hastings on paper, but close everything else, in which case they wouldn't have any employees left in Minnesota, so they would likely subcontract out with Midwest and with Charter to operate the system until such time as they are able to resolve the ownership issue. In both scenarios, there's, almost in all likelihood, a legal challenge, whether it's an immediate injunction or just a straight federal lawsuit. And they would probably, again, these are all just me guessing, probably allege that the basis on which the city denied, assuming it's on legal, technical, financial qualifications, somehow was not a sufficient or reasonable basis on which to support the denial. And then we would be in a position to try to defend that, probably working through the League of Minnesota Cities to serve as our defense counsel. The question I've come to when I've been really asked that question hard and I've had to think about the answer is, what is the ultimate objective that the city would be shooting for if it denied? And if the answer to that question is we'd like this to not happen and we'd rather stay with Comcast because it's a more stable, more financially secure operator, the likelihood of us achieving that objective, given what I just described, that the transaction will in all likelihood close regardless, means we can't achieve that objective. So while I could make plenty of fees handling the litigation, and while we could go down that road, if we can't articulate beforehand what our clear objective would be, it makes it difficult to understand what the path for settlement would be, and whether even if we prevail, we win the battle but potentially lose the war. And that's unfortunately the result that I see when I analyze what benefits you would get from that. I know that's not a politically popular answer because it feels like you're painted into a corner, but given the scope of this transaction, that's kind of where we find ourselves.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. And one thing else to note, Your Honor, is that the Utilities Committee will be taking a look at the franchise agreement coming this summer into fall with preparation for 2016 when that agreement ends, I guess it would be at that point. With that, Your Honor, I'd like to make a motion to approve the motion as presented.
Councilmember Nelson moves the resolution before us. Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Councilmember Alangi. That motion is now before the body. I want to thank Brian for this resolution. It does, in a sense, and I'll just throw it out to cover our butt, and it also allows us the room to negotiate in the future. And I think we operate in strength with this resolution as opposed to to being no. So we are positioning ourselves in a great way with the future cable operator in the city of Hastings because of this resolution, and I appreciate having it before us. Councilmember Schultz.
Your Honor, I'm sorry, I know the mayor almost always gets the last word, but I wanted to say thank you to Tom Wright, because he's kind of been in the know on all of this stuff all summer and has kept the cable board apprised, you know. And most of the time when we have meetings, he'd say, well, we went back to our attorney, and he said, we have another extension. And that's kind of how this has all gone forward, and this is, while the information is confusing and sometimes conflicting, I think it's one of those bitter pills you almost have to swallow to move forward. And I'm hoping that maybe we can get a really good franchise agreement coming in October of 2016. So,
Mr. Grogan helped us do that. I think we'll achieve it. Is there any further discussion? Councilmember Balsanic.
Yes, Mayor, I'm going to abstain from voting.
Okay, Councilmember, for the reasons why you stated earlier? Okay. If there's no further discussion to the motion, all those in favor of that motion say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion, one nay. Councilmember Brock's in the negative. All those, the motion prevails. Thank you. Okay, thank you.